Module 2, Overview. This module consists of a brief discussion of laws affecting landscape practices and definitions and understanding of non-point source pollution and Florida-friendly landscaping principles. This module is intended to give you the base knowledge required to understand the next 4 core BMP presentations. At the end of this module, you'll be able to describe how GMPs address environmental issues according to federal, state, and local laws, define non-point source pollution and its negative impacts on the environment, explain how urban stormwater systems function, and describe landscaping principles that protect Florida's water resources. Let's begin by discussing the federal, state, and local laws affecting water quality and landscape management. Federal legislation regarding water quality began with the Clean Water Act. Since the passage of the Clean Water Act and the formation of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, tremendous strides have been made in cleaning up our air and water. Most of this cleanup has been accomplished through permitting and the regulation of point sources of pollution, such as factory smokestacks. The Clean Water Act began in 1948 as the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. This act was revised in 1972 and amended again in 1977. The act authorized the EPA to implement pollution control programs. Water quality standards are either numeric or narrative depending on their designated use. Watershed assessments are required if waters are impaired and are reported to the EPA and the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NPDES. These permits control the discharge of point sources into water. Directed by the Clean Water Act, EPA requires states to monitor and report on water quality using standards agreed upon by federal, state, and local regulators. Designation of an impaired water body directly affects the landscape practices you perform in the designated areas. Water bodies that do not meet water quality standards are identified as impaired for the particular pollutants of concern, such as nutrients, bacteria, mercury, etc. In order to clean up the impaired water body, it requires an analysis and a management plan. The process begins by determining the total maximum daily loads, TMDLs, for the impaired water body. TMDLs are based on a scientific determination of the maximum amount of given pollutant that surface water can absorb and still meet the water quality standards. Over the past 20 years, surface waters in Florida have become very sensitive to even small additions of pollution, which have caused widespread ecosystem changes in our sensitive estuaries, lakes, rivers, and the Everglades. As a result, state legislation and local codes were enacted. In the following slides, we will highlight these rules and regulations and follow with more detailed discussion in later modules. The Florida Watershed Restoration Act of 1999, the Florida Urban Turf Fertilizer Rule of 2007, and the Florida Friendly Landscaping Module Ordinance 2009. Last, we will discuss the law requiring all commercial fertilizer applicators to acquire the limited certificate for urban landscape commercial fertilizer application issued by the Florida legislature enacted the Florida Watershed Restoration Act in 1999 to protect Florida's waters through the Total Maximum Daily Load, TMDL program for state ground and surface waters as required by the Clean Water Act, CWA. By definition, a TMDL is the total amount of pollution discharge from all sources that a water body can assimilate and still meet water quality standards. Furthermore, TMDL can also refer to a document that describes the discharge allocations. An implementation plan must be developed describing how the point and non-point sources are planning to meet their discharge allocations. This implementation plan is referred to as a base. In 2007, the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services adopted a rule addressing labeling requirements for urban turf fertilizers. It's important to note that the 2007 Urban Turf Rule is an administrative rule, not legislation. This rule regulates how much nitrogen and phosphorus the bag may contain. It also directs the manufacturer to recommend the use of BMPs for professional applicators and golf course or athletic field managers. While this rule only applies to the manufacturer's label for fertilizer, many local government ordinances and future state requirements may require that applicators abide by the recommendations on the label. In addition, weed and feed products are legally pesticides. For pesticide fertilizer combination products, the label recommendation carries the full force of state and federal law. Excessive nutrient loading to Florida's surface and groundwaters is one of the biggest water quality issues facing our state. It is far easier and less expensive to minimize the amount of nutrients that get into our waters than it is to treat stormwater and other non-point sources of pollution to remove nutrients. In early 2009, a fertilizer-only model ordinance and a revised general ordinance were published. That year, the legislature passed a Florida statute which made the model ordinance for Florida-friendly fertilizer use on urban landscapes a minimum requirement for each county and municipal government located within the watershed of a water body or water segment that is listed as impaired. A local government may adopt additional or more stringent standards than the model ordinance, if it is required, and if it meets the criteria described in the Florida statute. In 2009, the legislature revised Florida Statute 373.185 to prohibit local, even private, prohibitions of implementation of Florida-friendly landscaping. It also recognized Florida-friendly landscaping as the official state landscaping program and a partnership between FDEP and UF-IFAS, and directed water management districts to use the FFL publications and programs while allowing them to continue to address local needs with additional materials. The law also redefined the 9 principles of Florida-friendly landscaping, and components of Florida-friendly landscaping include planning and design, soil analysis, and the use of solid waste. The Florida legislature identified a model ordinance as a minimum to be followed for local ordinances. Know the ordinances regulating fertilizer or landscape practices in your area. Local ordinances may be stricter and more inclusive than state laws. Commercial fertilizer applicator, as defined in Florida Statute Chapter 482.1562, Paragraph 9, means any person who applies fertilizer for payment or other consideration to property not owned by the person or firm applying the fertilizer or the employer of the applicator. In 2009, new laws were passed that will require all commercial urban landscape fertilizer applicators to obtain and maintain a limited commercial fertilizer applicator certificate, LCFAC, from the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services by January 21, 2014. An application fee of per Florida Statute, Chapter 373.4595, Best Management Practice is defined as a practice or combination of practices determined by the coordinating agencies based on research, field testing, and expert review to be the most effective and practicable on-location means, including economic and technological considerations for improving water quality in agricultural and urban discharge. Simply put, BMPs are the best ideas of the best companies, coupled with science and applied with judgment and common sense. One of the key learning concepts of the GI-BMP training program is understanding non-point source pollution. Next, we'll discuss non-point source pollution and its connection to you and water quality. Non-point source pollution comes from diffuse sources and is associated with the long-term effects of everyday activities. It's carried primarily by rainfall and irrigation water, which cause pollutants that have accumulated on the land surface to run off into surface waters or to leach into groundwater. Water is the primary mechanism for the transport of dissolved chemicals through the soil. Non-point source pollution may not be obvious until a rainfall event occurs, leading to stormwater runoff from roads, parking lots, suburban areas, and farms. As Florida's population has soared, this type of pollution has become an increasingly important issue in the state. Where does non-point source pollution come from? In a play on words, non-point source pollution is often called pointless personal pollution because we all produce it, and so much of it can be reduced just by paying attention to the little things we often do not think about. The effects of non-point source pollution are cumulative. Each of us only contributes a small amount, but collectively it all adds up, creating large pollution problems in water bodies. In the same way, all the little things we do individually to prevent pollution can add up to make a big difference. We all need to be part of the solution to non-point source pollution directly affects water quality. We depend on a high standard of water quality for a number of uses in Florida. How do you prioritize your needs? Reducing non-point source pollution protects water quality. As we discussed earlier in this presentation, TMDLs are useful in identifying quantities of point source pollutants of materials entering a water body. Many times non-point source pollutants are also problematic regarding water quality. Due to Florida's unique geology and climate, it is highly sensitive to pollutants entering from stormwater runoff and leaching into groundwater. Activities associated with construction, landscape installation and maintenance can cause reduced turbidity, lower dissolved oxygen, higher nutrient content, heavy metals, and fecal coliform bacteria. Think about this picture. Imagine water flowing on the surface. Where does it come from? Where does it go? For the most part, urban landscapes are surrounded by impervious surfaces such as sidewalks, driveways, streets, and rooftops. An impervious surface that drains into a water body or stormwater system is called a directly connected impervious area, DCIA. Fertilizer inadvertently applied on these surfaces has ready access to our water resources through storm drains. This is why it is so important to keep fertilizer off impervious surfaces and to remove any that is applied to them and deposit it back onto the landscape. Stormwater runoff is the water flow which occurs when soil is infiltrated to full capacity, heavily compacted, or covered with impervious surfaces that do not percolate into the ground. Stormwater is excess water from irrigation, rain, snowmelt, or other sources. When runoff flows along the ground, it can pick up soil contaminants such as petroleum, pesticides, or fertilizers that become non-point source pollutants. Leaching is an environmental concern when it contributes to groundwater contamination. As water from excessive irrigation, rain, flooding, or other sources seeps into the ground, it can dissolve chemicals and carry them into the underground water supply. Of particular concern are hazardous waste dumps and landfills, and in agriculture, excessive fertilizer and improperly stored animal manure. Nitrate nitrogen, NO3, will leach in sandy soil types under leaching conditions. Therefore, soil texture, cover selection, type, and application rates of fertilizers all should be taken into account to avoid excessive nutrient loss. Using appropriate cultural practices correlates directly to the amount of fertilizers, pesticides, and water used in a landscape. Today's training recommendations are based on the Florida-friendly landscaping principles that provide a healthy landscape with minimum negative effects on the environment. Adopting appropriate cultural practices is essential to reducing non-point source pollution associated with urban landscape maintenance. Non-point source pollution can be reduced simply by adopting recommended cultural landscape practices, for example, appropriate irrigation, fertilization, mowing, and pruning procedures. When each of these is performed properly, the need for pesticides is reduced because plants and turf grasses are healthier and more resistant to pest problems. Get the picture? A land area which produces runoff draining into a common point is called a watershed. Urban watersheds are comprised of storm sewers that transfer storm water from impervious surfaces to lakes and rivers. Ultimately, all watersheds are connected to each other and to the underground aquifer that supplies most of Florida's drinking water. Therefore, it's important to implement landscape cultural practices within the urban landscape that protect and conserve water quality. Remember, as a landscape professional, it's your responsibility to educate your customers on appropriate cultural practices and why they are important to follow. Florida-friendly landscaping, FFL, means using low-maintenance plants and environmentally sustainable practices. As mentioned earlier, Florida law defines the 9 principles of Florida-friendly landscaping to include planting the right plant in the right place, efficient watering, appropriate fertilization, mulching, attraction of wildlife, responsible management of yard pests, recycling yard waste, reduction of stormwater runoff, and waterfront protection. Additional components of Florida-friendly landscaping include planning and design, soil analysis, and the use of solid waste compost, practical use of turf, and proper. The Florida-friendly landscaping program delivers science-based education to green industry professionals, homeowners, home builders, and developers. The program is a partnership between the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, Water Management Districts, the UF-IFAS Environmental Horticulture Department, and the UF-IFAS Extension Center for Landscape Conservation and Ecology. The first Florida-friendly principle is right plant, right place. Because many of the plants used in Florida vary widely in their adaptation, consideration should be given to choosing grasses and other plants that are suited to their particular environment. Right plant, right place considers moisture, light, soil type, temperature, and other characteristics of the planting site. Principle number 2, water efficiently. Saves the company and client money and protects groundwater supplies and water quality. We all know water is a limited resource and should be used wisely, but we often overwater our landscapes unintentionally. Irrigation management, knowing when and how much to irrigate, is the cornerstone of water conservation and reducing non-point source pollution. By choosing and operating a watering system correctly, you can reduce water bills, decrease plant problems, and lower maintenance requirements. Fertilize appropriately to prevent pollution and maximize plant health. Time fertilizer applications to maximize plant use and minimize adverse environmental impacts. Plants use the most nitrogen during periods of high growth and less when dormant. Too much fertilizer can weaken a plant, promote disease, and invite pests, in addition to wasting money and harming the environment. It also means more pruning and mowing, so consider your plant's needs carefully before applying any fertilizer. A mulch layer around trees, shrubs, and planted beds provides many benefits. In areas that are difficult to mow, irrigate, or otherwise maintain, use mulch to replace turf or ground covers. Also, consider placing mulch in shady areas where many plants don't grow well. Animals have trouble living in today's heavily urbanized landscape. By providing food, water, and shelter for birds, butterflies, bats, and others, you can help these displaced Floridians while bringing beauty and benefits to your home landscape. Select plants with seeds, fruit, foliage, flowers, or berries that animals can eat. Supply water, such as a rain garden or bird bath. Leave snags or dead trees, if they do not create a hazard, for birds to perch and nest in. Concerns for human and environmental health have led scientists to recommend integrated pest management, IPM, a strategy that helps gardeners manage pests with as few chemicals as possible. Landscape maintenance activities like pruning generate yard waste that you can recycle to save money. Encourage clients to recycle pruned branches and small clippings. Once decomposed, the organic matter can be returned to their landscapes, releasing nutrients back to the soil in a form that plants can easily use. Reduce stormwater runoff. Because Florida's groundwater is so close to the surface, the health of our groundwater is directly linked to the health of our visible water bodies, and the way we maintain our landscapes can have a powerful impact on both groundwater and surface waters. A rainstorm can wash exposed soil, landscape debris, oil, fertilizers, and pesticides off your landscape, creating stormwater runoff. A healthy, properly maintained lawn and landscape can absorb and/or filter stormwater runoff, helping to protect Florida's waters. The last principle, but extremely important, is protect the waterfront. Florida boasts over 10,000 miles of rivers and streams, about 7,800 lakes, and more than 700 freshwater springs, and the U.S.'s second longest coastline. Even if you don't perform maintenance directly on one of these water bodies, you do work in what's known as a watershed. What you do in the landscape has much further reaching consequences than you might think. One of the most important steps you can take to protect any water body is maintaining a 10-foot maintenance-free zone around it. Do not mow, fertilize, or use pesticides in this zone. Don't let any grass clippings or pet waste get into the water, as these carry nutrients and harmful bacteria. Let's take a moment to review a couple of scenarios occurring in a typical landscape. Does the image demonstrate a best management practice, according to what you have learned so far in this presentation? Would this be something you would or would not do? Don't. Do. Inspect fertilizer application equipment before applying nutrients. It's important to note that the green striping can occur from equipment malfunctioning. This is a waste of time and money. Would this be something you would or would not do? Don't. While this is a great example of the ring of responsibility that we discuss later, we should always consider protecting the shoreline. Declining turf grass will lead to soil erosion near the water's edge over time. It's important to add buffer plantings to prevent runoff, erosion, and soil instability. Over time, buffer areas will provide an ecosystem for aquatic life. Would this be something you would or would not do? Don't. Do utilize the components of Florida-friendly landscaping, including planning and design. Now that you have reviewed the overview module, you should be able to describe how GMPs address environmental issues according to federal, state, and local laws. Define non-point source pollution and its negative impacts on the environment. Explain how urban stormwater systems function, and describe landscaping principles that protect Florida's water resources. This concludes the overview module.